Hello, my name is Dr. Zachary Markwith, and I'm the Education Director at Islamic Networks Group, or ING. This video is a preface to other videos on this page and addresses the origins of stereotypes against marginalized communities in the United States, including African, Latino, Asian, Jewish, and Muslim American communities. Why are we having this conversation? Because we've seen a rise in bigotry, discrimination, and hate crimes against all population groups motivated by both race and religion. Despite major advances following the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and regardless of how well educated a person of color is, or the type of profession they have, or their status in society, like being president or mayor of your city, that person can still be racially profiled and discriminated against across different sectors of society. So how did we get here? Next, I'll provide an overview of the historical roots of narratives about marginalized communities, narratives which are interdependent. The historical roots of racism are found in colonialism, although for Jews and Muslims, it goes back even further, which led to what scholars call racialization, or the grouping and classification of people by skin color. We include Jews and Muslims in this discussion because they've also been racialized as non-whites. This eventually led to internalization, or what we call today unconscious bias, where we've been conditioned to believe certain things about ourselves and other people, which then creates structural racism. Let's discuss European colonialism first. European colonialism began in the 1400s with the so-called Age of Discovery and ended in the mid-1900s when most colonized nations gained independence. Colonized powers, who included Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, used various justifications for colonization, including church doctrine. So, for example, Pope Alexander in his 1493 public doctrine asserted that Christians had rights to colonize, enslave, and convert not just native peoples in the Americas, but also promoted Christian domination over non-Western nations. In the US, this was the inspiration behind the idea of manifest destiny, which was the 19th century belief that American settlers were divinely destined to expand across the continent. When Europeans began colonizing Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, their three main motivations were access to resources, spreading Christianity, and gaining power over each other because European countries were in competition. And they asserted control over colonized people by defining Europeans or whites as superior to occupied peoples, whom they viewed as primitive, in need of civilizing, and natural enemies of Christianity and Western civilization. This explains why many of the depictions that we have of certain non-white groups look the way they do. Native Americans were depicted as savages, Blacks were depicted as non-human or criminal, and Chinese as threatening. Non-white women were similarly often depicted as oppressed or sex objects. And of course, non-Christian communities were often denigrated, with Hindus viewed as pagans who worship many gods, Jews as Christ killers, Buddhists as submissive, and Muslims as warring infidels. These disparaging narratives lead to further justification through a process of what is now referred to as racialization. Racialization is when people with certain physical similarities are assigned to racial groups, and these racialized groups are then assigned certain attributes and placed in a hierarchy that privileges whiteness and justifies the oppression of a subordinate group by representing them as less than human. Diverse African nations were lumped together into what we call Blacks or Africans and viewed as backwards. Indigenous peoples from different tribes were grouped as one category, American Indians, and described as savages. Muslims today, despite their diversity and origins in over 50 Muslim-majority countries, are viewed as one group, implying that the only thing that defines them is their religion, and are assigned the category of terrorist. Racialization is then reinforced in culture and becomes racism when these disparaging narratives about entire groups of people based on the color of their skin or religion is upheld by various sectors of society. In education, erasure happens when history is taught only from a Western perspective, thereby diminishing the stories and contributions of people we're learning about. Popular culture disseminates the same narratives through the media, which generally portrays Blacks, Latinos, Muslims, and others in a negative light, and Hollywood, which often casts non-whites in stereotypical roles. Literature is commonly written from the standpoint of white protagonists. Video games often marginalize these groups as the enemy. The internet and social media are often used to promote racist stereotypes. Racialization and racial hierarchies are also reinforced through domestic and foreign government policies. This long history of racialization and the narratives and policies it produced have impacted how we view certain groups. This is called internalization, which refers to the adoption of stereotypes about entire groups. These beliefs are often subconscious and may produce a visceral reaction towards other groups, such as viewing Muslims as terrorists, fearing Blacks as dangerous, or suspecting that Latinos are undocumented. What is even more harmful is that the subject group internalizes these beliefs. Internalizing such beliefs produces unconscious attitudes towards those groups, which is called implicit bias, as opposed to explicit bias, which is conscious. Studies show that people's subconscious biases can override their values, which means that even if we don't believe we're biased or racist, our subconscious can make us behave in biased or racist ways, especially in times of fear or stress. This explains why Muslim women in hijab or Arab-speaking Arabic can be pulled off of planes for no other reason than passengers or pilots believing that Muslims are a threat. All of this has led to structural racism, which is a larger problem. Implicit bias then contributes to structural racism by reinforcing it through the actions of ordinary people, including how we vote on policy. Structural racism imposes oppressive or negative conditions on racial or ethnic groups so that it's difficult for any member of the group to escape the impact of racism. Minorities are often treated unequally in housing, education, employment, wealth distribution, domestic and foreign policies, the criminal justice system, and healthcare. Biased policies such as the war on drugs, the war on terror, ICE raids and deportations, and the former policy called the Muslim travel ban all have adverse effects on these populations. How do we overcome centuries of being fed negative views about people, where we've been conditioned to view certain groups in a negative light? It won't be easy, and it has to be intentional. The first place to start is to learn more about the diverse cultural groups in your region. By understanding their long history of marginalization and discrimination, and by learning more about each group's culture. Next, be intentional in our actions. Challenge any assumptions we have, and by being self-aware in all of our interpersonal interactions. Thank you, and I invite you to view ING's videos with African, Latino, Asian, Jewish, and Muslim American speakers on this page discussing how the history of discrimination against their communities impact them today.